Greenbrier County, West Virginia. The winter of 1897, the air was cold, still, and heavy with silence. In a small farmhouse nestled between rolling hills and bare winter trees, a young woman named Zona Heaster Shue lay dead at the foot of her bed. She was only 23 years old. To her neighbors, Zona had seemed healthy, full of life. She had been married for just 3 months to a blacksmith named Erasmus Trout Shue. But now, without warning, she was gone. The first person to find her was a local boy Trout had sent to the house with an errand. The child opened the door and froze in horror. Zona lay stretched out on the floor, her body strangely positioned, her face pale. The boy ran for help, his cries echoing through the valley. When Trout arrived, his reaction was immediate and unusual. Instead of calling for a doctor to investigate, he insisted on preparing her body himself. He dressed her in a high-collared gown and wrapped a veil tightly around her face. Anyone who tried to approach was waved off. He held her lifeless form in his arms, rocking back and forth, sobbing loudly, but never allowing anyone to see her neck. When the local physician finally arrived, he gave only a brief glance. Trout never let him examine her fully. With Trout weeping and clutching her, the doctor gave in and declared the cause of death to be an everlasting faint, a vague term for heart failure or childbirth complications. The death certificate was signed. Zona was buried quickly, and that, most believed, was the end of the story. But in Greenbrier County, whispers spread. Quickly, neighbors murmured that Trout's grief seemed rehearsed, more for show than sorrow. Some swore they saw bruises around Zona's neck before he covered her in the high-collared dress. Others noticed how desperately he kept anyone from approaching her coffin. The ground closed over Zona's body, but the questions did not. And for one person, the unease was unbearable. Zona's mother, Mary Jane Heaster, had never trusted Trout. She thought her daughter had married too quickly, that something about the blacksmith was off. And now, as she stood at the graveside, she watched him closely. His tears came easily, but she noticed his hands gripping the coffin as if he feared what might be seen. That night, as the snow fell softly outside her window, Mary Jane prayed. She begged for the truth. If her daughter's death was not natural, she asked God, or perhaps Zona herself, to send her a sign. Before we continue, let me ask you this. Do you believe the dead can speak? Have you ever felt the presence of someone who has passed? Tell us in the comments. And while you're here, subscribe to Cold Mysteries. Every day, we walk the thin line between history and the unknown. Now, back to Greenbrier. Because the truth was about to claw its way from the grave. In the nights that followed, Mary Jane began to feel uneasy. The farmhouse seemed colder, darker. Shadows clung to the corners longer than they should. And then she saw her. Zona appeared at the foot of her bed, pale, her eyes deep with sorrow and rage. At first, Mary Jane thought it was grief, playing tricks on her mind. But when the figure whispered her name, when she felt a chill hand brush her arm, she knew this was no dream. Zona had returned, and she had something to say. In the days after the funeral, the town of Greenbrier tried to move on. Life in 1897 was hard enough without dwelling on tragedy. The winter still demanded firewood, livestock still needed care, and families prayed for spring to come quickly. But inside the Heaster home, there was no moving on. For Mary Jane Heaster, the mother of the dead bride, grief had settled like a stone on her chest. She could not eat. She could not sleep. And most of all, she could not silence the nagging thought that her daughter had not died naturally. Mary Jane replayed the funeral in her mind, over and over. She remembered how Trout Shue had insisted on dressing Zona's body himself, an unusual act for a grieving husband. She remembered the collar pulled so high, the scarf tied so tightly around her daughter's neck. She remembered how Trout refused to let anyone touch her, how he hovered over the coffin with the desperation of a man guarding a secret. And she remembered the look on his face, not sorrow, but something closer to fear. Neighbors tried to comfort her. It was God's will, they told her. Zona is in heaven now. But Mary Jane shook her head. She knew her daughter too well. Zona had been strong, healthy, and full of life. Something was wrong, and she intended to find out what. One night, unable to bear her doubts, Mary Jane knelt by her bed and prayed. She asked God to reveal the truth. If Zona had been taken by foul play, she begged for a sign. The candle on her nightstand flickered, shadows crawling across the wall. The house was silent, except for the crackling of the fire. And as Mary Jane whispered her prayer, a chill filled the room. It was as though the very air shifted. The silence deepened into something alive, heavy, pressing against her skin. She lifted her head and froze. At the foot of her bed stood Zona. Not the Zona of memory, bright and laughing, cheeks flushed with youth. This Zona was pale, almost translucent, her wedding dress hanging loosely around her thin frame. Her eyes were dark, sunken, filled, with a sorrow that cut deeper than grief. Mary Jane gasped, clutching the blanket to her chest. Her heart pounded. Zona opened her mouth and spoke. Her voice was soft, echoing as if carried on a cold wind. "Mother, I did not die of illness. He killed me. Trout strangled me. He broke my neck." Mary Jane's blood ran cold. Her lips trembled. "Zona, my child, is it truly you?" The figure nodded slowly. Her head tilted at an unnatural angle. And then, as suddenly as she had appeared, she was gone. The next morning, Mary Jane sat at her kitchen table, her hands trembling around a cup of tea. She told herself it had been a dream, the product of grief and exhaustion. But a part of her knew better. She remembered the way Zona's voice had sounded, the way her neck had tilted, the icy touch of her presence. These were not details a dream could invent. Mary Jane decided she would not dismiss it. If the dead had returned to speak, then the living had a duty to listen. That was only the beginning. Because the following night, Zona came again. And this time, she would not simply whisper. She would show her mother the truth in a way no one could deny. The second night after the funeral, Mary Jane Heaster lay awake in bed. She had not eaten, barely slept. The memory of her daughter's pale figure at the foot of her bed haunted her thoughts. And as the clock in the hallway struck midnight, the air in the room chilled once more. Her candle flickered low, then died without warning, and there she was again. Zona stood in the shadows, her wedding dress glowing faintly in the moonlight that slipped through the cracks in the window. Her face was not the soft, kind face Mary Jane remembered. It was rigid now, her eyes sharp with anger. "Mother," the apparition whispered, "I told you. He killed me. He choked me until the breath left my body." As she spoke, Zona lifted her hand to her throat. Slowly, she turned her head to the side and twisted it further and further until Mary Jane could hear the crack of bone echo through the room. Her daughter's head now rested at an impossible angle. Mary Jane gasped, tears welling in her eyes. She clutched her rosary tightly, whispering prayers but could not look away. Zona's voice grew louder, firmer, filled with the weight of the grave. "Do not let him escape, Mother. I was murdered." And then, as quickly as she appeared, she was gone, leaving the room in darkness. The following night, the haunting returned. This time, Zona's figure appeared closer, almost solid. She sat on the edge of the bed as though alive, her presence bending the mattress. Mary Jane could smell the faint scent of earth, the smell of the grave. Zona's voice was colder now. He was cruel, Mother. You feared him, and you were right. I suffered at his hands before my death. And then, when I resisted, he broke me with his hands. Her pale fingers brushed against Mary Jane's arm, icy as winter water. The sensation jolted her to the core. She could not deny it. This was not a dream. She was touching her dead child. On the fourth night, the ghost came again. This time, she was not sorrowful. She was resolute. Her form stood tall in the moonlight, her voice steady. Mother, listen to me. My husband did not just kill me. He strangled me in rage. My windpipe snapped. My neck broke between the first and second vertebrae. That is how I died. Remember this. Tell them he cannot hide forever. As she spoke, Zona turned her head once again, displaying the grotesque angle of her neck. Her eyes met her mother's, unwavering, pleading. And then she was gone. By the fifth day, Mary Jane Heaster was no longer merely a grieving mother. She was a woman with a mission. She told neighbors of the visions. Some dismissed her as mad with sorrow. Others, however, whispered that the ghost's words rang true. Had they not seen Trout's strange behavior at the funeral? Had they not noticed his obsession with keeping everyone away from the body? Mary Jane began writing down every detail, every word her daughter's ghost had spoken. She swore she would not rest until Zona's killer faced justice. For 4 nights, the dead had spoken. For 4 nights, Zona's voice rose from the grave, accusing the man who had vowed to love her. The town dismissed it as grief, but Mary Jane knew it was more. The dead did not return for comfort. They returned for justice, and soon the law would listen. By the end of the 4th haunting, Mary Jane Heaster was no longer simply grieving her daughter. She was transformed. From a mourning mother into an advocate carrying a message from the dead. Zona's spirit had revealed the truth. And now Mary Jane carried that truth like fire in her chest. But who would believe her? In 1897, in the quiet mountains of West Virginia, the testimony of a ghost was hardly something a court of law would welcome. Still, Mary Jane was determined. She walked to the home of John Alfred Preston, the local prosecutor. Her black shawl pulled tight against the biting winter air, her eyes hollow but burning with resolve. When Preston opened his door, Mary Jane wasted no time with pleasantries. "My daughter was murdered," she said, "and I can prove it." Preston, a man of law and logic, raised an eyebrow. "Madam, the physician declared her death natural. What proof do you have?" Mary Jane leaned forward, her voice unwavering. "She told me. Zona came to me. 4 nights. In a row, she showed me how he broke her neck, between the first and second vertebrae." "You must exhume her body." Preston stared at her, stunned. A grieving mother he could dismiss. But the detail, the precise medical description, was chilling. It was not the kind of thing a farmer's wife would know on her own. Preston did not immediately agree, but doubt gnawed at him. He had heard the rumors in town, how Trout Shoe had behaved strangely at the funeral, how he had dressed the body himself in a high-collared gown, how he had refused to let anyone near her. And now this. A mother's claim that her dead daughter had spoken with anatomical precision. Preston decided he could not ignore it. He agreed to look into the matter further. The first step was to speak, again with the physician who had signed the death certificate. Dr. George Knapp admitted with visible unease that he had not fully examined Zona's body. Trout had been so distraught, so insistent, that Knapp had felt pressured to keep the inspection brief. I only looked at her face and hands," Knapp confessed. "He wouldn't let me see more. I thought it kinder not to push him." Preston's frown deepened. "A husband who blocks an autopsy? a doctor who bows to his demands. Combined with Mary Jane's testimony, it was enough to act. In late February of 1897, the prosecutor ordered Zona's body exhumed. Word spread quickly through Greenbrier County. Some whispered that Trout Shue was a murderer. Others scoffed, claiming Mary Jane had lost her mind and Preston had been a fool to listen. But beneath the gossip ran a current of fear. If Zona's ghost had truly returned, what else might she reveal? The day of the exhumation drew near, and the entire county seemed to hold its breath. When Trout Shue heard the news, his response was peculiar. Instead of outrage, instead of grief renewed, he grew agitated in another way. He paced, muttered, lashed out at those around him. "They won't find anything," he shouted at neighbors. "This is nothing but foolishness." But his protests only deepened suspicion. One farmer remarked, "He looks more nervous than a man with nothing to hide ought to." And so the stage was set. The grave would be opened. The truth of Zona's death would be revealed, and soon the ghost's accusations would meet the cold judgment of science, a grieving mother, a ghostly accusation, a prosecutor caught between law and legend. Greenbrier County was about to witness something no courtroom in America had ever seen before. A murder case built not only on evidence, but on the testimony of the dead. The morning of the exhumation arrived in March 1897. The graveyard was quiet, blanketed in frost, the mountains standing silent, as if even the earth itself waited for what was about to be unearthed. Villagers gathered at a distance, their breath clouding the cold air. They whispered nervously, their eyes darting between the open grave and the blacksmith, Trout Shue, who stood nearby with his jaw clenched, arms folded, watching like a hawk. Men with shovels dug through the frozen ground, striking against the coffin lid with a hollow thud. When the box was pried open, a hush fell. Zona's body lay inside, preserved by the cold winter earth. Her burial gown was still pristine, her features pale but recognizable. Mary Jane, though not permitted to stand close, clutched her shawl tightly, whispering prayers. The coroner and two physicians stepped forward. Preston, the prosecutor, watched intently, and Trout shifted uneasily, muttering to himself. The doctors began carefully. They checked her limbs, her chest, her stomach. Nothing unusual, but when they reached her head and neck, Trout's composure cracked. He paced faster. He fidgeted. At one point, he even shouted, "You'll find nothing wrong. She died of natural causes." But the physicians ignored him. They pulled away the high collar and scarf Trout had wrapped around her neck. And then they froze. There, faint but unmistakable, were bruises. The coroner leaned closer. Zona's throat bore marks of fingers pressed deep into the flesh. Her windpipe was crushed. And then came the most damning evidence of all. Her neck was broken. The first and second vertebrae were fractured clean through, exactly as the ghost had described to her mother. The physicians exchanged grim looks. There was no longer any question. Zona Heaster Shue had not died of illness. She had been murdered, and only one man had both the access and the motive. When Trout heard the word murder, his face drained of color. He barked angrily at the doctors, insisting they were wrong, that they were conspiring with Mary Jane to ruin him. But the townsfolk watching saw something else in his eyes. Panic. Later, one witness swore he looked as though he saw the ghost, standing beside her, pointing at him. Mary Jane, upon hearing the findings, bowed her head. Tears slid down her cheeks, but there was no triumph, no satisfaction, only confirmation. Her daughter had spoken the truth. Within hours, authorities moved on Trout Shue. He was placed under arrest for the murder of his wife, charged formally with strangulation. As he was led away in shackles, he shouted curses at the prosecutor, at the doctors, at the people of Greenbrier. But Mary Jane noticed something peculiar. For all his anger, He never once denied harming Zona. Not once did the words, "I am innocent," pass his lips. It was as if, beneath his fury, he knew the walls had closed in. Greenbrier County was stunned. Some whispered that Mary Jane had been visited by her daughter's spirit, that the ghost itself had guided justice. Others claimed it was grief and intuition, sharpened by a mother's love, that had pushed her to insist on the exhumation. Either way, the result was the same. The truth had risen from the grave, and Trout Shoe would now face trial for murder. But the story was far from over. Because in the courtroom, Zona would return once more, not in shadow, not in silence, but in testimony that would echo across history. The grave had spoken. Science had confirmed it. And now, in a trial unlike any America had ever seen, a ghost would take the witness stand. After the autopsy revealed bruises and a broken neck, Erasmus Trout Shoe was arrested and charged with the murder of his wife. But for the people of Greenbrier County, the arrest was only the beginning. Because soon they would discover that Trout Shoe had carried shadows with him long before he came to West Virginia. Shadows darker than anyone had guessed. On the surface, Trout was a respectable man, a tall, broad-shouldered blacksmith with skilled hands and a confident stride. He presented himself as ambitious, a man of trade and promise, but those who knew him closely whispered otherwise. He had a temper that could ignite without warning, a need for control that suffocated everyone around him. Zona had often seemed nervous in his presence, her laughter quieting when his eyes turned sharp. Now, with murder charges laid upon him, the whispers became shouts. Investigators began digging into his history. What they found only deepened the horror. Trout had been married before, twice. His first wife left him, citing cruelty. She spoke of beatings, of a man whose charm in public turned to rage behind closed doors. His second wife was not so fortunate. She died under mysterious circumstances. Neighbors recalled vague explanations, inconsistent stories, and a husband far too quick to move on. And now his third wife, Zona, lay in her grave with a broken neck. In jail, Trout Shoe was not humbled. He strutted in his cell as if he were a guest rather than a prisoner. He bragged to other inmates and even to the guards, insisting that no 12 men would ever dare convict him. He told one jailer with a smirk, "They've got nothing, just a hysterical old woman claiming ghosts speak to her. Do you think a jury will hang me over a dream?" But beneath the bravado, cracks showed. His pacing grew frantic when news of Mary Jane's visions spread wider. He demanded newspapers, desperate to see how the story was being told. And he muttered to himself late at night, his voice carrying through the stone corridors. One guard swore he heard him whisper, over and over, "She should have kept quiet, she should have kept quiet." Greenbrier County split into camps. Some sided with Mary Jane, convinced that Zona's ghost had indeed returned to accuse her killer. Others dismissed the idea, shaking their heads at the thought of a courtroom allowing ghostly testimony, but even the skeptics admitted something felt off about Trout. His arrogance, his coldness, the trail of misfortune that followed him from one wife to the next. It was too much to ignore. One farmer summed it up bluntly. "He looks like a man the devil's been walking beside his whole life." The prosecution prepared carefully. They knew the ghost story would capture attention, but they also understood they needed hard proof. They had the autopsy findings, the crushed windpipe, the broken neck. They had Trout's suspicious behavior at the funeral, dressing Zona himself, forcing her into a high collar. They had his violent reputation and the shadows of his past marriages. But the heart of the case would come down to one extraordinary testimony, Mary Jane Heaster, a grieving mother prepared to take the stand and tell the jury what her dead daughter had revealed. As the date of the trial approached, Greenbrier County buzzed with anticipation. Reporters traveled from nearby cities to cover what many called the trial of the century. Was it possible that the voice of a ghost could bring a man to justice? Or was this nothing more than a grieving woman's delusion twisted into evidence? Trout sat in his cell, smiling at the thought of being acquitted, but his eyes told a different story. They darted nervously whenever anyone mentioned Mary Jane's name. Perhaps he feared her persistence, or perhaps he feared the dead were not yet finished with him. The blacksmith's mask had cracked. His past was darker than anyone imagined. But in the courthouse of Greenbrier County, something even darker awaited, a testimony that would blur the line between the living and the dead. June of 1897, the courthouse in Greenbrier County was packed to the rafters. Farmers, merchants, churchgoers, everyone who could spare a day gathered to witness what had already been called the strangest trial in American history. Because this was no ordinary case of murder. This was the trial where a ghost was about to take the stand. The prosecution laid out its case with precision. Zona Heastershoe's autopsy revealed her windpipe crushed, her vertebrae broken, bruises encircled her neck. These were not the marks of illness, but of violence. They pointed to Trout Shoe's strange behavior at the funeral, his refusal to let anyone touch her, his insistence on dressing her himself, his selection of a gown that concealed her injuries. They spoke of his past, the cruelty, the violent temper, the wives who had either fled or died mysteriously. The evidence was damning, but it was not yet extraordinary. That would come when Mary Jane Heaster stepped forward. The room hushed as the grieving mother approached the witness box. Her black dress seemed to absorb the light, her hands steady as she placed them on the Bible. She swore her oath, then lifted her chin. The prosecutor asked gently, "Mrs. Heaster,
why do you believe your daughter was murdered?" The room leaned forward in silence. Mary Jane's voice was clear, unwavering. "Because she told me so. My daughter returned from the grave. She appeared to me 4 nights in a row and revealed—"
The truth. Gasps rippled through the crowd. The judge's gavel banged for order. But Mary Jane continued, unshaken. She described the visions in painstaking detail. Zona had appeared at the foot of her bed, pale and sorrowful. She had spoken in whispers at first, then with growing urgency. She had shown her mother how Trout's hands had gripped her throat. She had twisted her head until the bones cracked, and finally, Zona had revealed the precise injury, a broken neck between the first and second vertebrae. Mary Jane repeated those words for the jury.
Her voice never trembled. How would I, a simple woman, know such a detail? I knew it because my daughter told me, and when her body was exhumed, the doctors confirmed it. Spectators shivered, some crossed themselves, others stared in disbelief. The defense leapt to their feet, objecting.
They argued that grief had driven Mary Jane mad, that her testimony was nothing more than dreams twisted into memory. But the damage was done. The jurors had heard the words, they had seen the certainty in her eyes, and whether or not they believed in ghosts, the fact remained. The autopsy had matched her testimony exactly. Trout's lawyers tried to paint Mary Jane as unstable, a religious fanatic desperate for attention. They mocked the notion of ghostly visitations, but their attacks only made her firmer. She answered every question calmly, consistently, never once faltering. Her grief was obvious, but so was her conviction. One reporter later wrote, "It seemed as though the very dead spoke through her." Throughout it all, Trout sat at the defense table, his arms crossed, his face hard. When Mary Jane spoke of the ghost, his lips tightened. When she repeated the details of the murder, his jaw clenched. Some said he looked pale, as though he could see Zona herself standing in the room, pointing at him with unseen hands. His arrogance had faded. In its place was something colder, fear. The trial was far from over. But one thing had become clear. The dead had entered the courtroom. And whether the jury believed in ghosts or not, the evidence and the mother's testimony pointed to one conclusion. Trout Shoe was no grieving.
Husband, he was a murderer for days.
The trial of Erasmus Trout. Shoe gripped Greenbrier County like nothing before. The courthouse filled with spectators morning after morning, the pews packed with farmers in mud-stained boots, women in Sunday dresses, and reporters scribbling furiously in their notebooks. But on the final day, the crowd grew so large it spilled out the doors and into the street. Everyone wanted to hear one thing, the verdict. The prosecution reminded the jury of the facts. Zona Shoe had been found with her neck broken, her windpipe crushed, her body dressed to conceal the injuries. Her husband had prevented examination, behaved suspiciously at the funeral, and carried a history of violence and failed marriages. And then there was Mary Jane Heaster's testimony. The prosecutor did not ask the jury to believe in ghosts. Instead, he asked them to consider the simple fact. The details Mary Jane claimed to have heard from her daughter matched perfectly with the medical evidence. Whether by dream, by vision, or by Providence itself, the prosecutor said, the truth found its way to this courtroom. The defense attorneys countered desperately. They argued that Mary Jane's visions were delusions, the product of grief. They insisted that no court of law could convict a man on ghost stories. But the jurors did not need to rely on ghosts alone. The autopsy, Trout's behavior, and his violent history were damning enough. And the more the defense mocked Mary Jane, the more the jury seemed to turn against them. Her dignity, her calm persistence, stood in sharp contrast to Trout's arrogance and coldness. The jury retired to deliberate. The courtroom buzzed with anticipation. Mary Jane bowed her head in silent prayer. Trout sat rigid in his chair, lips pressed tight, his hands clenched into fists. An hour passed, then two. Finally the jurors returned. Their faces were pale, solemn. The room fell silent. The foreman rose. His voice was steady, but heavy with finality. We, the jury, find the defendant, Erasmus Shoe, guilty of murder in the first degree. Gasps filled the courtroom.
A murmur rippled through the crowd, a mix of relief and awe. Mary Jane wept quietly, her hands covering her face. And Trout Shoe, for the first time, looked shaken. His smirk vanished. His eyes darted around the room, searching for escape, for some last trick of control.
But there was none. The judge pronounced the sentence, life imprisonment. Some in the crowd had wanted the gallows, but the jury's decision spared him the rope. Even so, Trout's fate was sealed. He would never again walk the hills of Greenbrier.
As a free man, he would spend the rest of his life caged, his arrogance turned inward, left to rot behind prison walls. In the streets outside, the verdict spread like wildfire.
Some said justice had been done by law. Others swore justice had been done by something older, darker, more powerful than any judge. One farmer muttered, "It wasn't the lawyers that convicted him. It was Zona." She came back to see it through. Even the skeptics admitted the strangeness. How could Mary Jane have known the precise medical details before the autopsy confirmed them? Coincidence seemed too thin a word. As guards led him away, Trout spoke at last. "I will live to see 10 more wives before I die," he spat, his voice sharp with bitterness, but the courtroom only stared in silence. They all knew his life would not stretch beyond prison walls. And as he passed Mary Jane, she lifted her eyes and met his. For a moment, witnesses swore he flinched, as if, standing beside his mother-in-law, he saw another face watching him too, Zona's. The verdict was clear. The blacksmith was guilty, but what lingered in the minds of Greenbrier's people was not the sentence, nor the evidence, nor even the trial itself. It was the question whispered for generations after. Was Erasmus Shoe convicted by law or by the testimony of a ghost? The verdict was in. Erasmus Trout Shoe, once a proud blacksmith, was now a convicted murderer. His fate was sealed not by his neighbors, nor by his reputation, but by the words of his dead wife. carried into the courtroom through her mother's lips. But what became of Trout after the trial, and what became of the woman whose ghost demanded justice? Trout was sent to the state penitentiary in Moundsville, West Virginia, a cold and unforgiving place. The prison loomed like a Gothic fortress, its stone walls rising high against the grey sky. Inside, the cells were damp and narrow, the corridors echoing with the clank of chains and the moans of men who would never leave. At first, Trout carried himself with the same arrogance he had shown in court. He strutted through the cell block as though he was still the master of his fate. He boasted to other inmates, claiming he had been framed, that his wife's mother was mad, that the whole county had turned against him. But time has a way of breaking even the proudest men. Months stretched into years. The blacksmith's broad shoulders began to stoop. His strides slowed, his eyes, once sharp and calculating, dulled with fatigue. Prisoners whispered that he had grown paranoid. He claimed he could hear Zona's footsteps echoing in the halls at night. Guards reported he woke screaming, clutching at his neck as though invisible hands were tightening around his throat. One inmate swore, Trout told him, in a rare moment of fear, "She's here with me. I see her every night." Waiting, the man, who had once believed he could outsmart everyone, now trembled at shadows only he could see. In 1900, just 3 years after his conviction, Trout died in prison. The official cause was kidney disease, but whispers claimed otherwise. Some said he was found with his body twisted strangely, his head lying at an angle eerily similar to the way Zona's had been discovered. Others said his final nights were filled with screams that rattled the prison walls. Whatever the truth, his death brought a quiet end to his chapter of the story. But the tale of Zona and her return from the grave was far from finished. Mary Jane Heaster lived on for nearly 2 decades after her daughter's death. She never wavered in her account, never once doubted what she had seen. To neighbors, she became both a figure of sorrow and of strength. Some pitied her as a grieving mother who had convinced herself of ghostly visions. Others revered her as the chosen witness of divine justice. But Mary Jane herself cared little for gossip. She tended her farm, prayed in her church, and spoke often of the night her daughter returned. She insisted that Zona had not come to torment, but to reveal the truth. And until her final breath, she told anyone who asked, "I only did what any mother would do. I listened to my child." Greenbrier County never forgot. Children whispered the tale in candlelit rooms. Travelers came to hear the story of the ghost who solved her own murder. Even skeptics admitted there was something uncanny about it all. How could Mary Jane have known the precise details of her daughter's broken neck before the autopsy? Coincidence? Or something more? The legend grew, passed from generation to generation, until it became not just history, but folklore, a reminder that sometimes the dead speak more loudly than the living. Trout died a prisoner, his arrogance stripped away, his name forever cursed. Mary Jane Heaster died a believer, her daughter's whispers still echoing in her heart, and in Greenbrier County, the earth held a secret that even the grave could not silence, that justice may sometimes come not from judges nor from juries, but from the restless dead. Trout body lay cold in a prison grave, his arrogance silenced. Mary Jane Heaster passed quietly years later, a mother who insisted she had simply carried her daughter's words into the light. But the story of Zona Heaster, the Greenbrier ghost, did not end with their deaths. It slipped into folklore, it wove itself into history, and it remains one of the strangest cases ever recorded in American law. In the annals of American justice, this case stands alone. It is the only known instance where the testimony of a ghost, relayed through a grieving mother, was admitted into a court of law. The judge allowed it, not because he believed in the supernatural, but because Mary Jane's account had produced verifiable evidence: the broken neck, the crushed windpipe, the bruises hidden by her husband. The jury did not convict solely on the ghost's words, but the presence of that testimony gave the trial a weight no other case could match. And so, in a very real sense, Zona became the first and only ghost to help secure a murder conviction in the United States. More than a century later, historians and skeptics continue to debate the case. Some argue Mary Jane had seen the bruises herself, perhaps noticed her daughter's tilted head at the
Funeral.
and her visions were shaped by memory and grief. Others suggest she simply refused to let her daughter's death go unexplained, and her persistence, not the ghost, forced authorities to look deeper. But there are questions that cannot be dismissed so easily. How did Mary Jane describe the precise medical detail of the vertebrae, something only a trained doctor might know? Why did her account match the autopsy so perfectly? And why, even under hostile cross-examination, did she never falter, never contradict herself, never once waver in her claim? Coincidence or proof that the dead can indeed return when justice demands it? In Greenbrier County today, a small roadside marker stands near the old cemetery. It tells the story of Zona Heastershoe, the young bride who returned from the grave to name her killer. Tourists visit, ghost hunters whisper, locals nod knowingly, their families having passed down the tale for generations. The marker does not call her mad nor delusional. It simply records what happened plainly. A mother claimed her daughter's ghost spoke, the body was exhumed, the murderer was found. Fact and folklore tangled forever. What does the story of the Greenbrier ghost teach us? Perhaps it is that love
Endures even beyond death, that a daughter, silenced too soon, found her voice again through the bond with her mother. Perhaps it is that evil cannot be hidden forever, no matter how carefully dressed or tightly veiled. Or perhaps
it is that there are more things in this world than reason alone can explain. For the people of Greenbrier, the lesson was clear. The grave does not always keep its secrets. So tonight, as you sit in the quiet of your own room, ask yourself, a loved one returned from beyond the veil to speak to you. Would you listen? Tell us in the comments below. And don't forget to subscribe to Cold Mysteries, where every week we open another door into the shadows of history. But remember, some doors once opened can never be closed. Beat of silence, then a whisper. Hey, and Zona's door has never closed.